Lost in the Jungle, The Vanishing of Chris and Lizanne. April 1, 2014, Chris Kremers and Lizanne Friend set out on the Pianista Trail, their spirits high, their cameras slung over their shoulders. The jungle air was thick with moisture, the path winding through lush green canopies. They laughed, taking pictures, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. The first mistake was pushing too far. The well-trodden trail ended, but they ventured deeper, convinced they could loop back. By afternoon, the path vanished beneath their feet. The sun dipped behind the mountains, shadows stretched long, and the jungle whispered around them. Then came the realization, they were lost. April 2, 2014. Their phones were their lifeline, but every call for help failed. No signal. No way out. They rationed their water and followed the river, hoping it would lead to civilization. The jungle, once beautiful, had turned hostile. Eyes peered from the trees. At night, something moved just beyond their vision. Branches cracked under unseen footsteps. Their camera continued snapping photos. Some were deliberate, others, unexplainable. In the darkness, the flash revealed things neither of them remembered seeing. Shadowy figures standing among the trees. A pale face peering from the brush. April 3, 2014, they kept moving, exhaustion weighing on them. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Chris scribbled in their journal, trying to stay calm. But the entries became frantic. We are not alone. We hear whispering at night. It feels like the jungle is alive. Lizanne's ankles swelled from a misstep, slowing them further. They tried to stay near the water, but the jungle pressed in, suffocating. The eerie feeling of being watched never left them. At night, they huddled together, too scared to sleep. April 5, 2014, they were weak now. Their voices hoarse from screaming. A journal entry written in shaky handwriting revealed the depth of their terror. Something is watching us. We hear it at night. It never comes close, but we know it's there. Lizanne's phone died first. Chris's lasted longer. On April 6th, her phone was used again. Someone had tried to unlock it dozens of times. But Chris was already missing by then. The photos from that night were worse than before. Blurry shots of the jungle. The back of Chris's head. A single image of a bleeding temple. And then, one final, impossible picture. A woman, back turned, standing at the riverbank. Her hair is wet. Her clothes are clean. But Chris was gone by then. April 7, 2014, Lizanne was alone now. Her journal became erratic. She documented strange lights flickering between the trees. The sounds of laughter, distorted, unnatural, echoing through the jungle. Her writing was barely legible. Chris is gone. I don't know what took her. I hear her voice, but I know it isn't her. Something is pretending to be her. She tried to climb to higher ground, but her strength was fading. More failed SOS attempts. The camera was used again. Over 90 photos in total. Many were pure darkness, as if someone was taking pictures blindly in the night. But there were others, images of something moving between the trees, glowing eyes reflecting the camera's flash. April 9, 2014, silence. The jungle had consumed them both. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No explanation. Just the camera, the phone logs, and the eerie final pictures. Weeks later, their belongings were found. Scattered remains, a backpack washed downstream. Investigators tried to piece it together, but nothing made sense. The photos. The final, frantic attempts to call for help. The last journal entries filled with fear and confusion. And that final picture? It was taken at a time neither of them could have been alive. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No explanation. Just a lingering whisper in the trees and the feeling that something ancient, something patient, still waits in the jungle, watching, waiting for the next ones to stray too far. If you thought that was scary, wait until you hear this next story. The old cabin stood alone in the woods, a skeletal remnant of forgotten time. The trees around it leaned inward, as though whispering dark secrets to each other, their gnarled branches casting twisted shadows over the structure's decayed frame. The air smelled of damp earth and rot, and the wind carried with it a faint, almost inaudible hum, a sound that made the locals uneasy, though they could never explain why. Joshua Maddox had walked these woods many times before. Friends and family recalled his adventurous spirit, his love for the wild. And yet, in May of 2008, he had stepped into these trees and never returned. Search parties combed the area for weeks. Flyers with his face, bright-eyed, smiling, were plastered across town. But Joshua had vanished, leaving behind nothing but an open-ended mystery and a family drowning in grief. 7 years later, the cabin gave up its secret. It was a contractor planning to demolish the abandoned structure who made the discovery. When he removed the old chimney's rusted grating, an unbearable stench filled the air. Inside, wedged tightly within the narrow brick chute, was the mummified body of a young man, Joshua Maddox. His remains were curled, knees pressed to his chest, arms bent in an unnatural position. His clothes, his shirt, his jeans, his boots, were found outside, neatly placed near the fireplace. The chimney, it was noted, had been partially blocked off from the inside with a heavy wire mesh, an obstacle that would have made entering from the top nearly impossible. There were no signs of struggle, no fractures indicating a fall. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as accidental, a conclusion that failed to quiet the storm of unanswered questions. Had Joshua somehow crawled into the chimney himself? If so, why remove his clothes in the cold? How could he have fit himself into such a constricted space? And if he had been trapped, why had no one heard his cries for help? Locals whispered theories. Some believed Joshua had been fleeing someone, an unseen pursuer who had forced him into the impossible hiding place. Others suggested something far worse, something unnatural. The Maddox family, never satisfied with the official ruling, sought out old stories about the cabin. They found disturbing accounts. A man who had camped near the cabin in the 1970s recalled waking to the sound of scratching within the chimney, like nails dragging against stone. Another account, dating back to the 1940s, told of a prospector who had spent a single night inside and emerged the next morning, raving about a figure lurking in the dark corners, whispering to him in a voice that was not human. He left town soon after and was never seen again. Then there were the documents. In the county archives, buried beneath years of paperwork, an old ledger recorded an incident from the late 1800s. A young girl had disappeared near the same stretch of woods, her body never recovered. The report noted the discovery of a small handprint, blackened with soot, inside the chimney of a cabin that once stood in the very same place. As the investigators sifted through these eerie fragments of history, a chilling realization took hold. Joshua Maddox was not the first to vanish near that cursed structure. The final piece of the puzzle came from the contractor himself. He recalled seeing something when he first peered into the chimney, before the full horror of the discovery had set in. Just for a moment, in the dim, dust-laden light, he thought he had seen another face staring back at him. Not Joshua's. Something else. A face blackened by time and smoke, its hollow eyes glinting like embers. The truth behind Joshua's death remains an enigma. A cruel accident, an act of human malice, or something older, something waiting within the cold, narrow confines of that chimney. Perhaps the real horror is not just that Joshua Maddox was found there. Perhaps the real horror is that something else was waiting for him when he arrived. The sheriff's department revisited the case, spurred on by the overwhelming number of inconsistencies. They combed through old files, re-interviewed friends and family, and even consulted forensic specialists. Every detail only deepened the mystery. The strange placement of Joshua's clothing, the lack of trauma on his body, the sheer impossibility of him climbing in from the top. None of it made sense. Then an unexpected lead emerged. A drifter named Cal Thurman had passed through town in the summer of 2008, only weeks after Joshua disappeared. He had been seen frequenting the woods, muttering to himself, eyes darting about as if watching for something unseen. He had spoken of the Chimney Man, a figure he claimed watched from the dark spaces of old buildings, waiting for lost souls. Locals dismissed him as a lunatic, but now, in light of the discovery, his words took on a new, chilling significance. Digging deeper, authorities found similar legends spread across various towns, stories of people vanishing near abandoned structures, always near fireplaces or chimneys. The descriptions were eerily consistent. Whispers in the dark, the sensation of being watched, and, in the most horrifying cases, bodies discovered in impossible places, contorted as if forced into their final resting spots by an unseen hand. The sheriff's department brought in an anthropologist who specialized in folklore. She suggested that these tales, no matter how outlandish, had roots in something real, an old fear carried through generations, warning people to stay away from forgotten places. But what if, she pondered, these warnings were not just superstition? What if something ancient, something beyond understanding, had claimed those places as its own? One night, a group of paranormal investigators ventured into the ruined cabin, determined to uncover the truth. They set up cameras, audio recorders, and motion sensors. Hours passed with nothing but the occasional creak of settling wood. Then, in the early hours of the morning, their equipment picked up something chilling. A low, guttural whisper. A rasping breath. The words, though faint, were unmistakable. Still here. The cabin was demolished soon after, but those who had entered it never truly escaped. They spoke of recurring nightmares, visions of a dark figure crouched within a narrow space, hollow eyes glinting like embers. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind calling them back. Joshua Maddox's story remains unsolved, a mystery tangled in the roots of something much older than any of us. And though the cabin is gone, those who dare to wander too close to the clearing where it once stood report an unsettling feeling, as though something unseen still lingers there. Watching. Waiting. Brace yourself because the next story is even more disturbing. The Circle of Silence. The small town of Circleville, Ohio, was quiet. A place where nothing ever seemed to stir except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's name, their business, their struggles, and their secrets. Or so it appeared. In the summer of 1976, however, something stirred in Circleville that would tear the town apart, exposing the darkness hidden beneath its sleepy surface. Carmen Reynolds had lived in Circleville her entire life. The town was home, her roots, her history, everything. She married Jim Reynolds, a hard-working, quiet man who shared her love for the peaceful rhythms of small-town life. They had 2 children, and despite the occasional gossip that floated through the air like dust in a still room, their lives seemed ordinary. But that peace was shattered one ordinary Wednesday morning. Carmen found the letter in her mailbox. It was unmarked, the paper crinkled but clean, and the handwriting on the envelope was jagged, as if written by a hand that had once been steady but now trembled with something more. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the bold, crude scrawl inside. "I know about Jim. He's not the man you think he is. He won't be around much longer." The words were cold, sharp, like ice. Carmen's hands shook as she reread the letter, her mind racing. How could anyone know? What did this mean? Jim had been acting strangely lately, distant, preoccupied, but that was nothing new. He worked long hours, came home tired, and often seemed lost in thought. They had never been perfect, but they were a family, and that was what mattered. Until now. For the next few days, Carmen couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that someone was watching her. Someone who knew things they shouldn't. She convinced herself it was just a prank, a sick joke, maybe someone from high school who had it out for her. But when Jim died, just days later, in a car crash that seemed too precise, too purposeful to be an accident, Carmen's reality began to crack. The crash happened late one evening as Jim drove home from his job. Carmen had heard the screech of tires, followed by the sickening crunch of metal against stone. The police said the brakes had failed, that it was a mechanical failure, an accident. But Carmen couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. She stood beside the wreckage, feeling the cold rush of dread seep into her bones as she stared at her husband's lifeless body, twisted unnaturally, blood pooling beneath him like a grotesque stain on the road. The police called it an accident. But Carmen knew better. She felt the weight of the letter pressing against her chest, suffocating her with its implications. Jim's death wasn't a tragic fluke. It was a warning. And the sender of that letter, whoever they were, had known something. Something dark. She tried to ignore the whispers that began to spread through town. People were talking about the letter now, about the mysterious death, about how it all felt wrong. It wasn't long before the letters started arriving again. Not just for Carmen but for others too. The letters began to expose the town's secrets, names, scandals, quiet sins that no one ever dared speak aloud. At first, the townsfolk tried to dismiss it as a malicious prank. But the letters grew bolder, more specific, more chilling. There were accusations, threats, warnings. Carmen wasn't the only one who had received them. Several people, her neighbors, her friends, had received similar messages, each one more disturbing than the last. One letter she received described a deep, hidden affair between her closest friend, Laura, and her husband. Carmen had no idea. It was impossible, wasn't it? As the days passed, the paranoia grew. People began to look over their shoulders, eyes darting to shadows. Accusations flew like wildfire, burning friendships to the ground. No one could trust anyone anymore. And then a suspect emerged, a quiet, reclusive man named Roy Franks. Roy had always kept to himself, living in the dilapidated house at the edge of town. He had no family, no friends. He was the kind of man people would overlook, until they found the letters hidden away in his home. They were the same jagged handwriting, the same sickening threats. The police arrested him, and for a brief moment, Carmen allowed herself a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end. But then the letters kept coming. Days after Roy was jailed, the letters continued. The same cold, precise accusations. The same threats. Nothing had changed. Carmen's obsession grew. She dug deeper, looking for anything that might lead her to the truth, to the person who had started this madness. She scoured every corner of Circleville, retracing Jim's steps, asking questions, interrogating anyone who might know something. But every lead turned into a dead end. It wasn't until she received a letter that she realized the full extent of the terror. This letter was different. It wasn't about secrets, about guilt. It was a warning. You're getting too close. Leave this alone. Or next time it won't be a letter. The hairs on the back of Carmen's neck stood up as she read the words. She hadn't told anyone what she had been investigating. No one knew the depth of her obsession. And yet, whoever wrote this knew. The days passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. Carmen felt herself unraveling. Everywhere she went, she saw shadows in the corner of her eye, heard whispers just out of earshot. Even the familiar streets of Circleville seemed to shift, to twist in unnatural ways. The town had changed and so had she. She no longer recognized her own reflection in the mirror, as though the darkness had seeped into her soul. And then came the night that nearly killed her. She was driving home, her mind racing with theories, when she noticed something strange, a glint of light in the rearview mirror. She felt a chill, a presence behind her. The road was empty, the air still, but the fear clung to her like a shadow. And then it happened. A crash. A violent explosion of glass and metal. Carmen's car swerved uncontrollably, the brakes locking, the steering wheel jerking out of her grasp. It was as though the car had been tampered with, as if someone had rigged it to fail at the most critical moment. When Carmen regained consciousness, she was lying on the side of the road, blood staining her clothes. Her chest heaved with every breath as she looked around, her vision blurry. She should have died, but somehow she was still alive. The car had crashed. No, it had been sabotaged. Carmen staggered to her feet, her mind spiraling with questions. Who could do this? What was happening? She didn't know anymore. In the days that followed, the letters grew darker, more cryptic. They spoke of the town's dark past, of sins long buried, of ancient rituals and hidden forces. Carmen couldn't ignore the sense that something far worse than a human mind was behind this. There was an unmistakable sense of inevitability, as though the town itself was cursed, and whatever had been awakened could not be stopped. And then, in a moment of clarity, Carmen realized the truth. The letters weren't about her. They were about the town. The terror wasn't coming from one twisted mind, but from something much older, much darker, a force that had been silently feeding off the town's secrets for years, waiting to expose them, to tear them apart. As the final letter arrived, Carmen couldn't help but laugh, a hollow, bitter laugh. It was all connected, the truth she had been searching for. And as she read the final words, she understood. The silence of Circleville had never been broken. It had been waiting to scream. You were always meant to find the truth. Now there's no turning back. The town of Circleville would never be the same. And neither would Carmen. Now for another dark and haunting tale that will send shivers down your spine. The silence beneath the mat. It was an ordinary morning when Kendrick Johnson's body was found rolled up inside a gym mat. The scene, as described by the authorities, was almost too bizarre to be real. The young high school student, who had always been known for his boundless energy, his dreams of making it out of the small town, and his love of basketball, had somehow ended up wedged inside the thick, rolled-up mat in the school gymnasium. The police claimed it was an accident, that Kendrick must have fallen in while reaching for his sneakers. A tragic, yet entirely plausible, slip-up. But for those who knew Kendrick, and for those who refused to accept the official explanation, the truth was far more complicated and far darker than anyone was willing to admit. The investigation was quick, rushed, almost perfunctory. The local police wrote it off as an unfortunate mishap. They were quick to present their findings to the grieving family. Kendrick had suffocated after falling into the mat, unable to escape before he ran out of air. A bizarre accident, they claimed, but nothing more. No foul play. No need to dig deeper. Yet something didn't sit right with Kendrick's cousin Tasha. She had always been close to him, more like a sister than a relative, and she refused to let the official narrative stand without scrutiny. From the very beginning, she felt an inexplicable chill every time she thought about how Kendrick had been found, unreal, unsettling, and wrong in ways she couldn't explain. The gym was the heart of the school. It should have been full of activity that day, but everything about the scene felt unnaturally still when she stood there, staring at the spot where Kendrick had been found. The mat that had concealed him, now rolled up again, discarded like a piece of forgotten equipment, seemed to loom ominously as if it were guarding a dark secret. Her suspicions grew stronger when the family requested an autopsy. The preliminary report confirmed Kendrick's death was caused by suffocation. But there was more, much more, that the report did not explain. Kendrick's organs were missing. At first, the authorities insisted it was a mistake. The body had been processed quickly, they said. But when Tasha demanded answers, the truth began to emerge. Kendrick's body had been embalmed, his organs surgically removed and replaced with something that made no sense. Old, yellowed pages from newspapers. The evidence was irrefutable. The strange discovery sent shockwaves through the small town. Why had Kendrick's organs been removed? Why had they been replaced with decaying newspaper, covered in strange symbols and cryptic, unintelligible text? What could this mean? The more Tasha dug into the mystery, the more she realized that the story didn't just involve her cousin's death. It was part of something larger, something far more sinister than a simple conspiracy or a senseless act of violence. The gym mat itself seemed to be at the center of it, its presence almost suffocating. Something dark, malevolent, as if it were more than just a piece of fabric and foam. Every step of Tasha's investigation brought more questions, more inexplicable details. Surveillance footage from the night Kendrick had been found was missing, hours of it. The police couldn't explain the gaps, but Tasha suspected something had been tampered with, something hidden beneath the surface of the footage. It was as though someone or something was trying to erase the truth. She started to notice things that weren't there before. Symbols etched into the worn floors of the gym, faint but undeniable, appearing only when the light hit them just right. Strange occurrences followed her, little hints that suggested she was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the gymnasium seemed to shift when no one was around, and sometimes she could swear she heard whispers in the hallways late at night. Whispers that always stopped the moment she tried to track them down. As the days wore on, Tasha became more obsessed with uncovering the truth. Her family grew concerned as she pushed further into the investigation, but nothing would deter her. She had to know what had happened to Kendrick. She had to know what had really killed him. And then one night, as she pored over the old newspaper clippings, tattered, brittle, each page more disturbing than the last, she found something that made her blood run cold. In the margins of the pages, hidden beneath layers of ink, were symbols, ancient and strange, their meaning elusive. Some resembled runes, others like drawings of strange, serpentine creatures. Some were connected by a thin, delicate thread of ink, tracing paths through the pages that led nowhere, yet everything seemed connected. In the center of the page, under one of the symbols, was a word, one she recognized from an old family heirloom, a word whispered in hushed tones by her grandmother, a word that had always been part of their family's lore, spoken with caution and dread. A word that no one had dared say aloud in years. Moksha. It was a name, but it wasn't just a name. It was a title, an ancient force, something primal and unfathomable, linked to the oldest of rituals and the darkest of powers. Her grandmother had told her that moksha was something that could be awakened, something that could inhabit a person, take them over, make them a vessel for something far more ancient and dangerous than anything mortal. Tasha's mind reeled as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Kendrick's death was not an accident. It was a sacrifice, a ritual. And the gym mat, old, worn, the very thing that had held Kendrick's body, was the place where the boundary between the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, was thin. It was a conduit, a vessel for something else. But the true horror lay in what Tasha had uncovered next. In the very last of the newspaper clippings tucked beneath the symbols, was an image, a photo of the gymnasium. In the background, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was a figure. Its face was obscured, but its outline was unmistakable. Someone wearing the same jersey Kendrick had been wearing the night he died. The figure stood alone, watching, waiting. The deeper Tasha went, the more she realized that her investigation had spiraled into something she couldn't control. The more she uncovered, the more she was consumed by the presence, by the sense that she was being drawn into something larger than herself. And then the letters began. Not from Kendrick, not from anyone she knew, but from the thing that had taken him. The thing that had watched and waited and now sought to claim her too. "You're getting too close," one letter read, its ink smeared and faint. "But you can't escape." The terror grew. Tasha's world seemed to close in on her. The gym mat wasn't just a prop. It was a prison. The same force that had taken Kendrick was closing in on her, and there was nowhere left to hide. In the end, the truth, if there was one, remained obscured, lingering just out of reach, like a fading dream or a half-remembered nightmare. And so, the town of Lowndes County remained haunted, the mystery unsolved, the fear unresolved. What had happened to Kendrick Johnson was more than a tragedy, more than an accident. It was the beginning of something far darker. Perhaps some truths are too terrible to know. Perhaps some tragedies are simply the work of something more ancient, more horrifying, than any of us could comprehend. But one thing was certain. The gym mat had not only concealed Kendrick's body. It had concealed something much worse. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. The whistle in the night. The heat in Louisiana hung heavy, thick and suffocating in the air like a blanket pressed down on the small house. Even the night seemed sweltering, its warmth clinging to the skin, making every movement feel like an effort. Cora Desmarais had never minded the oppressive humidity before. After all, she had grown up here in this house, where the thick smell of moss and swamp water had always been a familiar comfort. The gnarled trees that lined her property stood like ancient sentinels, casting their twisted shadows across the yard, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. But something was different now. She had just gotten engaged. It should have been the happiest time of her life, and yet the old house, the one she had lived in her entire life, seemed to be closing in around her. She had not told anyone, not even her fiancé, about the strange things that had begun to happen. It had started with the sound of whistling. A strange, low whistle that floated through the open windows on the humid night air. At first, Cora thought it was a neighbor or maybe a bird, something familiar. But it persisted. Night after night, it came again, each time louder, more insistent, like someone trying to get her attention. The whistling wasn't like any tune she knew. It was eerie, discordant, and unsettling, a sharp, shrill sound that made her blood run cold. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Maybe the pressure of the engagement had gotten to her. Maybe she was just tired. But no, every night, without fail, it grew louder. It started to feel deliberate, like a message meant just for her. Then the phone call started. She had been in the kitchen one evening, preparing dinner, when the old rotary phone rang. She almost didn't pick it up, as she was used to telemarketers or wrong numbers, but something compelled her to lift the receiver. A heavy silence filled her ear at first, then a faint whistle. The same eerie sound that had been drifting through the night air. "Hello?" Cora said, her voice trembling slightly. A raspy voice broke through the static. "You're being watched." The line went dead. Cora's heart pounded as she clutched the phone in her hand. Her mind raced. Who could it be? Who knew she was here in this house, alone? The calls continued after that. Every night, sometimes multiple times. Each time, the voice remained the same, low, guttural, and barely audible, but always accompanied by that haunting whistle. The threats became more explicit. "I'll be there soon. You can't hide from me. You'll be mine, Cora." Her fiancé, Luke, tried to comfort her. He suggested that it was just some prankster, maybe a neighbor with too much time on their hands, but the fear gnawed at Cora. She could feel it in her bones, the terrible certainty that something was wrong, something far worse than a prank. And then one night, the whistling grew unbearable. Cora had gone to bed early, exhausted from the constant tension, when she awoke to a sound that made her blood run cold, the whistle. It was closer than ever, almost like it was in the room with her. The air was thick, the house unnaturally still, and the temperature had dropped, despite the humidity outside. She shivered under the covers, her skin crawling. For what felt like hours, the whistle filled the room, getting louder, more urgent. Her heart raced as the shadows around her seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. She dared not move, not wanting to break the eerie silence, not wanting to acknowledge the feeling creeping up her spine. And then, in the stillness, she heard it, the creak of floorboards. Someone was in the house. Cora's breath caught in her throat. She listened, her heart hammering, straining to hear anything over the pounding of her own pulse. There was no mistaking it. Someone was moving through the house, just beyond her door. Suddenly, the door to her bedroom creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and cloaked in darkness. Cora froze, unable to speak, unable to scream. The figure did not move toward her. It simply stood there, silent, watching. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. A cold wind, like the breath of something ancient and predatory, swept through the room, and Cora's mind raced with terror. But what terrified her more was the whistle, soft now but unmistakably there, echoing from behind the figure. Then the man spoke, his voice low, distorted, but unmistakably human. "You belong to me now, Cora." She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her mind spun, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, what she was experiencing. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare. But the cold, damp air, the oppressive silence, the sensation of eyes watching from every corner, it all felt too real, too tangible. She reached for the phone on her nightstand, but her hands trembled so violently that she could barely grip it. When she finally dialed 911, the line went dead before she could speak. The figure slowly took a step forward, his face hidden behind a mask, dark, smooth like the void itself. The whistle sounded louder, growing to a deafening crescendo. Then, as quickly as it had come, the figure vanished. The silence that followed was crushing. Cora didn't know how much time had passed, but when she finally managed to tear herself from the bed, she ran to the police. They came quickly, searching the house but found nothing. No sign of forced entry. No footprints. The house was locked from the inside. They dismissed it as a case of an overactive imagination. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. But Cora knew. She could still hear the whistle in her mind, could still feel the shadow of that masked figure looming over her, watching from the corner of the room. She wasn't safe. The man, whatever he was still out there. Days turned to weeks. The haunting continued. Every night, the whistling grew louder. Every phone call seemed to come from deeper within the shadows. Cora began to question whether she was losing her mind. Maybe she was just imagining it all, driven to madness by the stress, by the pressure of everything closing in. But when she tried to tell Luke, he started to pull away, his own skepticism hardening into something more chilling. Doubt. He began to question her sanity, to wonder if there was a rational explanation. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. Maybe the whistling was just wind in the trees, or some distant animal she didn't understand. But Cora knew what she had seen. She knew what she had heard. One night, the whistling was so loud it seemed to shake the walls. Cora couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. It was as if the sound was coming from inside her head, ringing in her ears, driving her to the edge of madness. And then, in the darkest corner of her room, she saw it again, a figure standing silently watching her. But this time she wasn't frozen. This time she ran. She ran out into the humid, moonlit night, down the driveway and into the bayou beyond. She could hear the whistling, closer now, so close it felt like it was inside her very bones, echoing in every shadow, in every step. She stumbled through the thick underbrush, her heart pounding, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. And then, in the distance, she saw him. The masked man standing at the edge of the water. The whistle was silent now and all was still. But when she looked into the man's eyes, deep, hollow, and endless, Cora knew that she was no longer just running from a man. She was running from something much older. Something that had been watching, waiting, in the dark corners of the bayou, for longer than anyone could remember. The phantom whistler was no legend. It was a reality. And it had come for her. The next morning they found Cora's car abandoned at the edge of the bayou. But Cora was gone. No one ever found her. But the whistling continued. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.